It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. Guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
Welcome to Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs, a podcast podcasted from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand, and it has been podcasted as of this episode 131 times. You can find the other 130 episodes at my website verbalhighs.com or through obviously your usual podcast provider and or app or platform. My guest for this episode is Riccardo Ball. I came to Riccardo through another local podcast that is a similar format to mine, open conversation, where a gentleman called Danny McCrum, who is a Korean musician, chats to creative people about getting by in the industry. And so I heard the episode with Riccardo and thought, yep, what a great guest. And so hit him up. Did the old cold call on the socials. You can bloody link up with anyone these days. And what mainly piqued my interest was the chat in that episode about radio programming, selecting and artfully curating the music on a format radio station, which we've got a lot in New Zealand. And Riccardo was a music director at The Rock for 9 years. So I figured this would be interesting. Like, I kind of framed and prepped this for the non-kind of radio nerd or broadcasting industry person because of you, dear listeners. Some of you may be that. But the idea is that everyone's heard radio, and I just think, an expert talking about getting under the hood of anything is really interesting, especially something as kind of omnipresent as broadcast radio. A few key topics hit: what programming the music for a radio station entails, how you differentiate a boss tune, he has a piece of music that will reside in his earbuds for many days on end because it's the most killer thing he's heard of all the music that comes across his desk. But that's very different to will this killer piece of music that I really like personally and is objectively a great example of music, will that actually work as a hit on format commercial radio? What we didn't cover about Riccardo, we could have talked about his comic and pop culture podcast, which he hosts with a friend and comic store owner. It's called Heroes for Sale. So just Google Heroes for Sale podcast if you want to have a hoon on that. We could have talked his mentoring work with young musicians. A mediated example of this, a entertainment-based example of this, designed for an audience, is a web series that Riccardo is one of the main characters in, called The Collective. It's made by RNZ. The basic gist is it's sort of the reality TV format in short form. A bunch of credible New Zealand music industry movers and shakers mentor some young musicians through young musicianing. Some young musicianing, bro. What very much could have been discussed more is Riccardo has been the front man for a metal band for many years, for probably about 20 years, and they've supported a whole host of very recognisable international artists. If you want to just go straight for the ear hoon, bro. If you want to hear Just One Fix, if you're not familiar already, Just One Fix NZ, all one word, no surprises with the spelling. Just One Fix NZ.bandcamp.com. He also has a music consultancy and mentoring business, which you can find at Wrecking Ball Media, all one word, wreckingballmedia.co.nz. If you're just on the hunt for knowledge, which presumably a lot of podcast listeners are by design, you could do worse than checking out an episode of podcast 99% Invisible called The Broadcast Clock. Show note, something I said, I'm always very conscious of treating my guests and framing them accurately and fairly. I talked about his getting into radio being his desire to be New Zealand's John Peel. And then I say that radio programming, which he got into, seems like a kind of nice option when the first one wasn't, which kind of implies that it was because of perhaps, Riccardo's skill level at attempting that. I didn't mean that at all. I meant that the reality is there isn't really an opening for even one of those in New Zealand. Bit of housekeeping for me. You can follow the show Verbal Highs on Twitter, Verbal Highs Podcast, on Facebook, verbalhighs@gmail.com if you want to get in touch. Riccardo's a nice guy, but then all my guests have tended to be nice people. Maybe I should start doing a show about assholes. The personality proctologist. The intimate explorations of some of New Zealand's most notable assholes coming soon. Thank you, Riccardo.
This is Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs.
How's the volume there?
Yeah, good.
Yeah,
good for me, good for you.
If you want to turn it up or down, that's number 2
I'm
there.
number 2. Cool.
I said number 2. How are you, Riccardo?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good, Lewis. Yourself?
I'm good. I chanced upon you through another podcast, who chatted to you in a similar format to this. I'm surprised we haven't crossed paths over the years.
Yeah.
How long have you been in broadcasting or radio?
Radio since 94.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm old.
I've been in radio since 94.
Oh, you're old as well then. Yeah, I did.
Botox.
I went and did radio school in Wellington.
Yeah.
Back in 94 and got my first job out of it in Tauranga at a station called Coastline FM in about September of 94, I think. That's where I started.
How long was the training? A year?
No, it was only basically a semester. So
wow.
It was about 3.5 months.
Did they pack a lot in? Did you get a lot out of it?
Yeah, tons. Yeah,
Yeah.
We had in 3.5 months. You had 14 modules to complete.
Yeah.
But I'm talking. This is pre-computer times, really. So,
Yeah.
we had a radio station at the school. Most of the music was still on vinyl. So
Yeah.
you
Sounds familiar.
Queuing things up on vinyl.
Carts,
You used a
still
cart
carts,
machine,
yes.
cart machine for the ads, and then recording things. It was all like 2 tracks, so having a splice edit and things like that. So yeah, real old school.
I like that, and this has come up on the show before. I like where we came on up though, at that intersection between digital and analog, because I feel like if you were 5 or 10 years beforehand, you might feel a little bit lost where things went.
Yep.
But I was kind of we got the first computer turned up in the production studio at the station, and like I remember. Arguably only a radio person would get the significance of this. For making our commercials and so on, we had a demo version of Cool Edit, but the kicker was it could only do 28 seconds. So how long's a radio ad generally?
30 seconds.
Yeah. So you'd have to get a little bit creative with how you did things.
They managed that pretty well, didn't they? Putting it out as a 28-second option.
Yeah. Actually, now I think about it, that's actually, if it was for the industry, that's actually very clever. We'll give them just enough. This has come up before, going to the provinces. Generally, if you want a gig, you just go where the work is out of school, right? Is that how it worked? You didn't have sort of like your eyes set on Tauranga, or?
No, not at all. I'm born and bred in Auckland, so I don't think I'd even been to Tauranga at that point. And I had 2 options. So I got an offer from Coastline FM in Tauranga with MediaWorks, and I got an offer from, what are they called now? Something Hokanui Gold FM in Gore.
Nice.
And you're like, Tauranga or Gore? Where do I go? And no disparaging to Gore, but
that was around the time that the Havoc show had kind of like Gore had become sort of like Gore meant something else in New Zealand at the time.
It did. Well, the beaches in Tauranga won it for me.
Yeah.
So,
and were you on air or behind the scenes?
On air.
Yeah.
So and that was the thing that has been lost to the industry, like you talk about sort of 5 years later. The gig I did wouldn't have been available because I was doing midnight to 6, right? And so they needed someone live midnight to 6. I was playing CDs and carts. There was no computer, so that was how I got my foot in the industry.
Whereas now you do what they call voice tracking, right? And you do everything prior. Was it enjoyable? Like I enjoyed doing those graveyards.
Oh, graveyards were great.
Yeah.
I mean, and then the old Coastline FM building in Tauranga, I 100% guarantee you, I'm not a big spiritual guy, but there was something weird going on in that building.
How did you keep your life together doing graveyards? Like I always remember the taste of bad coffee at 5 in the morning, and were there any? I don't think humans ever adjust to like guys that do. I mean, whatever industry, like doing graveyards. I don't think your body ever particularly goes, this is a great idea.
No, never. And you're always tired.
Yeah,
and I did that for. I did it. The first stint I did it for about 3 months.
Yeah.
And then I was doing this thing where, so you'd come into work you do your mid-dawn, you finish at 6. You had to sit in and be there be the receptionist until the receptionist got there, so you had to be there. And then when she got there, you had to go and do the dishes, right? That was part of the deal.
Right.
For a princely sum of $16,000 a year, I think it was, or something. And you did all that, and then what I used to do is I would go and sit in with the production engineer because I wanted to do production.
Great, yeah.
And I would learn from him. And I won't say his surname, but this guy Dave, who was doing it, and I was new to the industry, right? And I was all about rock and roll. And he would, at 10 o'clock in the morning, have a massive glass of red wine next to the desk.
Oh, my God. Of any booze to have in the morning, red wine in particular.
Yeah, and I thought, well, that's rock and roll. This is radio. This is normal. And about, like I said, beginning of December, end of November, beginning of December, his missus shipped him off to rehab, and all of a sudden we had no production engineer, and so I was it. I got thrown in the deep end for Christmas. Yeah.
And did you enjoy it in there?
I did. It was single swim. You know, I was pulling 16-hour days because, the volume of ads coming into Christmas was so high back then that I was making all sorts, and I was still new. So, what took him 10 minutes probably took me half an hour. And
tape machine is probably a little bit slower procedure-wise than digital?
Yeah, very much so. I had an 8-track, so I had to mix everything on 8-track, down to a 2-track, and then onto a cart from there.
And so what was the attraction to radio, man? Like for example, I didn't really consider this at the time. Obviously, often you reflect and realise there's stuff like... I used to do stuff like record bits of the radio, but the announcers as well as the music. Something about the audio format I was really drawn to you.
Yeah, I've got tapes somewhere that my grandmother she kept them and pulled them out at my 21st. My uncle had this like a 2-tape ghetto blaster type thing.
Yeah.
And so I'd put a tape in and I would record the songs.
Yeah.
And then when the songs finished and the DJs came on the radio, I would flick over to the mic input and I would do my own voice breaks.
Riccardo FM.
Yeah, like do sports updates and do, music news and do all that sort of stuff. So I was doing that from probably when I was about 10 years old.
Where'd you grow up?
Out East Auckland, Pakuranga, Howick, around that way. So yeah.
How's that? Because you're out Te Aratū now. You're a Westie now. How's where you grew up changed in your lifetime?
Oh, ridiculously.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, you can go past Pakuranga College now.
Yeah.
It's like American Mile. There's just so many takeaway places. There's Carl's Jr. and KFC and McDonald's and all the rest of there. And across the road from the school, there used to be horse paddocks when I was going to school. And now it's all completely built up.
There's probably less businesses now, or in that community where you grew up, like everything becomes a bunch of chain stores that everyone works for, right?
Yeah, totally. There is that. I think the mum and dad businesses now they're still there, but they're just different businesses.
Yeah,
so
they're vape stores, they're bottle stores,
they're vape stores, they're bottle stores. They're we'll fix your tablet or your iPhone stores. They're they're $2 stores. They're that sort of thing, as opposed to Jim's record spot and things like that.
What did your folks do? Like, are you? I'm guessing, Riccardo, that you are of Italian heritage.
Yeah.
And
are you people say Spanish?
A first or second generation?
Well, it's kind of 1.5, if you like, because Mum was born here, but not long after Mum and my grandparents came out after the war. She didn't speak English until she went to school.
Wow.
So she grew up within the community that was here.
Yeah, right.
And so she got to school not knowing any English outside of hello, pretty much. And they were very insular with their community. I guess a bit like, sort of 20, 30 years ago when we first started getting the big Asian migrations. They tended to be very much insular in their communities as well. Stick with what you know. It makes perfect sense. And they were the same. So that's why I say 1.5, because, I think they were here 3 years before she was born.
And your dad's not Italian?
No, Dad's not Italian.
Kiwi?
Dad's, Kiwi, Irish.
Yeah.
Which is funny because a lot of people think I'm Māori, but on my mum's side of the family, we've got Greek and Albanian and Serbian and Croat and all sorts going. We're a melting pot, right?
Yeah.
And my mum goes so do I, go real dark in the summer. So mum's been asked if she's Indian and Samoan and all sorts. So, yeah.
I got to thinking, because when I was prepping for this, because I lived in Melbourne for a few years, the Italian community, Greek community, a lot of those kind of vaguely related ethnic communities are kind of much more visible there. Is it just a numbers thing? Is that what it is, or is it just rather than...
And I think it depends, because where did you grow up?
Wellington.
All right. Okay. Well, the Greek community in Wellington's reasonably visible.
Here's a story. When I was prepping for a class many years after growing up in Wellington and living there, I thought that there was a huge Greek population in New Zealand, right? And so I'm doing this week, I think it was for a class on like ethnic media, like newspapers and the value of them and stuff. And I'm like, I can't remember the number. It was like, what? There's only 1,106 Greek people in New Zealand. I'm like, I went to school with 950 of them, you know? It's like the whole of the eastern suburbs, you're right. And Italians in Island Bay, right?
Yeah, as well. And you know, sort of in Auckland, if you're in West Auckland, it's very Dalmatian, like very Croatian, Dalmatian, you know, so it's visible there. Yeah. You know, that's where down McLeod Road in Te Aratu is where the Croatian Cultural Society is. Yeah. And that's a massive place. You know, they've got football pitches and all sorts in there, so.
So did a love of sport perchance come from your heritage? Because I'm thinking like football, the world game, it's a stretch, or, you know, because I'm guessing that if you're doing sports radio now, which we'll get to in a bit, that there's been a love of sport there for years, right? Are you just a sports nut?
Yeah, I kind of was as a kid, particularly. I mean, but not so much mum's family, not so much. More dad's family. And dad was kind of, you know, he's what's he, third generation Kiwi? But he, you know, and he grew up in Glen Innes, post-war, sort of, you know, he was born in 52. His brother was a really good rugby player and played Auckland Bees, Auckland Under-21s, but Dad never did. He always played soccer, right? So he was always a soccer football guy. In fact, at Selwyn College, where he went, his best mate at school was Andy Dalton, the former All Black captain, and he was the first 15 captain, and Dad was the first 11 captain. Right. So there was that kind of tie. And so, but it's always been sport. You know, Dad was a good runner. He did boxing, you know, and sort of. So he was always sport orientated, and I was always gravitated towards that.
Well, gravitated towards. Did you play a lot of sport?
Yeah. So I played a lot of cricket. Yeah. I played a lot of football. I played a little bit of rugby, and then I switched and went and played rugby league. Played rugby league for quite some time. I played volleyball. Played a lot of squash.
Wow.
So yeah, done all sorts. You know, and I mean, I never did. Well, I played National League football, but not for one season. I wasn't really good enough, but I played it I managed to get in and get 4 or 5 games in. But I was never a great sportsman at anything, but I was okay. I was passable at a lot of things. Yeah, you know, so. Yeah.
Back to radio, so you get to Tauranga first job. It sounds like basically a paid on-air internship, so despite the dishes and all of that, it sounds overall like you just be a sponge for that period of time, right? What's the trajectory from there to ending up doing radio in Auckland and ending up with the rock and so on?
I was in Tauranga from late 94 till about late 97, I think. So I was down there for about 3 years. Yeah. And what happened is that was... I literally got there when we were playing carts and CDs, and it wasn't long after that on-air computers came in. And so we got more of that, and then they started networking things, right? So Coastline FM was owned by MediaWorks. They
So you were there when just the number of on-air opportunities just shrunk overnight.
Yeah, totally. So they brought Radio Otago, which used to be a thing, and they had a couple of stations in the city, and I ended up working on 2 stations at the same time. So they brought the rock in, and so the rock at that point was in Hamilton, Taranaki, and Tauranga. Yeah, and they were starting to work out how they could network. And so the breakfast show was networked, the drive show was networked, but they had like a jukebox at night. Yeah. And then the day show was separate in each market, so they could do sales stuff around it, right? So I would pre-record a show for classic rock 92 FM, which was the Radio Otago station they had procured, and would do the live show on the rock. They were 2 separate stations that they were competing with each other.
Odd thing I find about that, you're kind of playing make-believe. Like there's a genuineness to chucking the mic on. Did you find that part weird and hard? Just don't mention what the weather's doing outside the window when you're doing the Otago show.
It's a bit like acting, you know. It's like, okay, I'm not really a homicidal maniac who's trying to kill this person, but when you say action, I flick the switch and I become that for then. I was a bit like that when I'm doing the pre-recording. It's like, okay, what have we got coming up here? I'm looking at it and I'm going to play that song, I'm going to tell that story, I'm going to look at that, I'm going to give this sports result or whatever it happens to be. And then, so in my head, and then you go from being, okay, this is what I'm going to do, to flip the switch, and then boom, you're larger than life and you're delivering it.
You ended up on air at Hodaki for a while? Was that how you ended up at the Rock eventually?
Yeah, well, I mean, I worked with MediaWorks, so I knew all the rock guys from Hamilton. And then I moved when I moved up to Auckland, Hodaki were looking for promo people and for people that could fill in shifts.
Yeah.
So they called me the only Dutchman to work for Hodaki. I was rock van driver, and so I'd drive around their rock vans and do all their sales stuff and their process.
That's quite a funny name.
Yeah. It was
credit their radio guys.
Yeah,
credit
exactly.
their creative.
Oh mate, honestly, it's where dad jokes come from. Radio, honestly.
Yeah.
I'd fill in. I'd be like, hey, Dave White can't do his show today 10 to 2. Can you come in and do Dave White's show? Or hey, the night guy's away. Can you come in and do this show? And I got opportunities like one day. An opportunity to interview Ozzy Osbourne came up, and nobody on staff was confident to do the interview, and they were like, he likes heavy metal. So they rang me and said, can you come in and interview Ozzy Osbourne? I was like,
was this before, because he did a bunch of interviews on the B-Net, I think late 90s.
Yeah.
And I've talked to someone who did one of them, and this was before everyone knew Ozzy through the TV show.
Yeah.
So was it quite surprising, the quite sort of baked fella that you got on the other end of the line?
Yeah, I wasn't really sure what I was going to get, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it didn't start well because, and this is quite funny now that I think about it, I've just turned 50.
Yeah.
Ozzy had just turned 50 when I interviewed him, and I was, how old was I? I would have been 26, maybe 27. Yeah. Something like that. And I was just like, oh, Ozzy, you've just turned 50. How much longer can you keep doing this? And it was completely the wrong thing to ask him, which I now know. And he just went, well, what a stupid question. I mean, how long's a piece of string? And he went off on one. I kind of lost him then. But
Hodaki's kind of like baked into New Zealand radio folklore, right? Did it feel like quite bloody chuffed to be working at Hodaki?
Yeah, well, I mean,
or Hauraki, as we called it back then.
Back then, yeah. I grew up listening to Kevin Black
and
Phil Gifford when they were doing the breakfast show there. So, I was stoked to work for Hodaki. And I ended up doing the breakfast show with Willie DeWitt and Dean Butler for a while as well. So it was definitely a ticked box in I managed to achieve that.
Often in the industry with on-air talent, people make a career out of bouncing back and forth between the duopoly over the years. And sometimes it's things like when the ratings shift and someone says, here's a huge wedge if you come to our side. Did you get poached or asked to come to the Rock?
Yeah, I mean, and there wasn't a huge wedge, to be fair, but they were moving. They were moving from Hamilton to Auckland because they were still based in Hamilton, but networking to Auckland.
Yeah,
and they were moving operations to Auckland, and so they said, and I was having personality clash, shall we say, with the guy who was running Hauraki at the time.
Yeah.
So I wanted out, and so I took the opportunity. I went to Hamilton for the weekend and did, I think, 12 hours over 2 days shifts while everybody moved to Auckland, all the staff, and then it was up there and then became their promotions manager for Auckland.
It was like, just keep this thing going while we move all the furniture and everything. Like, don't fuck it up.
Yeah.
So it's like a telethon style.
So I did a 6-hour shift one afternoon and a 6-hour shift the next afternoon, yeah.
The key reason you got into radio was a love of music, and I think in your words you were like, you wanted to be a take on John Peel in New Zealand, and opportunities to do that in New Zealand admittedly are pretty few and far between. So I'm guessing that getting into programming is kind of the next best thing in terms of having some control and also a whole lot of new music coming across your desk. Talk about that role.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to it than when you get to it, what you expect. But I loved it. And I've never been much of a tech stats guy. Yeah. But it's all driven by tech and stats. Even the DOS program that we used to use on the first master control and things. But I grew to love it and understand it and how to use packets and do all those other things that you could do in that to make it tick. Yeah,
it's kind of a combination of maths and art.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
So for the layperson, we're dealing with a thing called the format clock. There's basically X amount of categories of songs, right? Mm-hmm. And some of them play on a lot higher rotate. And then isn't the general held wisdom that they start off in that higher rotate and then they kind of either fall back and they stay on the playlist for a while, or they just drop off if they don't cut the mustard?
Yeah, well, what we used to have what we called a B rotate, which was new.
Yeah.
And then if something worked really well as a new song, then it would go up to an A.
Yeah.
And then you would run it on an A until it burnt.
So it wouldn't go in as an A, it would just go in and sort of...
Very rarely would it go in as an A. If the Foo Fighters released a stonker or, U2, often those would go straight in as an A. But generally you tested stuff on a B rotate, which still played reasonably often. Yeah. If it went well, it sounded good in the program, and within the program, then you'd shift it up to an A.
And how often is music entering the playlist or leaving the playlist? Because I'm thinking like stations like Classic Hits and stuff, your kind of playlist is the same for eternity.
Well,
we discovered a new Phil Collins track. Oh, but no one's actually heard it, so it's not going in there.
Yeah.
Right?
I suppose that's kind of like, the
Yeah.
sound, we deal with that now, and that's about trying to find older tracks that are fresh, and that's why they make a big deal out of playing albums. Like, they will play full albums, they will play hidden tracks. So they do that because that's how they have to keep it fresh, because even if Bruce Springsteen's a core artist and he releases a new song, they're not going to play it. They might play part of it once in breakfast or something, but they're not going to add it to playlist.
But as far as those stations go in those two big networks, this is a total guess, you guys would have been turning over music more than a lot of the other stations, right?
Yeah, and probably not as much as CHR.
Yeah.
Like the Edges and the ZMs. They're probably weekly. We were fortnightly, unless something really stank the place out, or if something new dropped that we thought we have to be playing this now.
Please explain stank the place out.
Well, there's sometimes you get a song and you think this is going to work, and you play it, and the listeners will let you know that you shouldn't be playing it. I don't know how it works at the CHRs, but generally at the Rock, we looked at the text machine and we listened to the callers and stuff. There was a band I worked with recently, actually, who asked me to help them get on Hodaki and the Rock. Yeah. And they had this song that they'd done, and I managed to convince the Rock to play it. They were like, yep, we'll play this. And they played it, and I thought it was a good song. It was a cover, and I thought they'd done a really good job of it. Lasted 4 days, and they just said, we've never had this amount of reaction to a song that people don't like it. And so they took it off. And
you don't solicit that feedback, right? They provide you with free live market feedback.
Very, very much unsolicited generally. But and that's part of it. It's part of it is checking the vibe and admitting sometimes you're wrong. Like, as I said, worked with Brad at the Rock for a long time, who's still there as the boss. Yeah. And when Audio Slave Like a Stone came out, he was like, no, I don't think so. Too slow, too morose. It's not going to do anything. And then obviously he had to cop. And every now and then we dealt with Sony, who were the Audio Slave record company at the time. Every time we said no to something, they would go, well, you said no to that, remember? And look what happened. So,
So you also, like, as well as dealing with the kind of maths and science of the programming clock, you're also, like, kind of reading the zeitgeist. So you must have tried to push the boundaries a few times, because like the thing that, like, don't take this the wrong way, but because I love my metal and I love my rock, but some of my mates who are metalers full stop, there can be a little bit of conservatism there that they're not aware of, in terms of you're nodding your head like you haven't said something untoward. There could be like, it's like, come on, be a bit more fucking open-minded is what I'm saying.
Totally.
I could imagine that what it is, you program something, you go, this is a great tune, it's killer, ticks all the boxes, great tune, quality, and then just two texts coming straight away and go, what's this shit, Yeah,
totally. Well, you would always get two, but it would have to be more than two.
No, I know.
But you're right. I mean, there is a certain... there is a certain core audience with the Rock particularly, that they knew what they liked and they knew what they didn't like. And they were very, in a way, given how rebellious rock and metal is supposed to be, they actually end up being quite conservative.
And another thing about it, I hadn't thought about this before, if you're drawn to format-based radio, part of it is you want that comfort and that familiarity.
And this is kind of a little wider programming conversation. But there were songs that we played when I was at the Rock that I didn't think we should play, but we played them for the reason that it was a directive from upstairs, right? So they wanted us to play songs that weren't necessarily guitar anthems, which is what the Rock was generally championing. So that if somebody who had listened to ZM or the hits or more happened to be cross-tuning because they were in ads or whatever, and they came across the Rock, they would stick. They would go, I know the song, and they'd be quite happy to sit there. So, and this is nothing on the songs, because they're good songs in their own right.
I get the whole logic around it.
So, like, Ob Shop One Day, right? That is not a rock song.
No.
Like, it's a beautiful song. It's a well-written song, but it is not a rock song. But we played that because it was a big hit everywhere else, and if everyone else was playing it, we should play it too. So there was some familiarity you have your P1s, which is your core listeners, and your P2s, which is your cross-tuners, and it was a song that we played for the P2s.
I haven't heard that term before, the P2, the cross listener. Did it seem quite radical when, because when I got back to New Zealand, I think I got back about 2007, and when I turned on Hodaki, it was like, if they keep playing Welcome to the Jungle and Sweet Child of Mine, if they play, it was a really kind of limited scope to their playlist, and then it radically changed and Riddler started programming dance music.
Yeah.
Was that a bit of a jolt where you guys were?
It was a massive jolt.
Yeah.
And I still don't get it, to be honest. David Riddler is a mate, and he loves music, and he has an understanding of music.
It was B for the older folk who no longer listen to B, right?
Yeah. And there was also a bit of, I don't know if you remember Andrew Schusterman, Andrew Schusterman?
Yeah.
So Schusty, when he came back, I mean, he'd been ZM, and then he'd gone to the UK, worked for MTV over there, and he'd worked, I think, at XFM it was, in London, and he came back, and XFM, their format was that they didn't have a format. And that they
freeform, baby.
Yeah, they basically, if it's new and it's good, we'll play it. Doesn't matter what style it is.
Yeah.
And he tried that with Channel Z, and that went sideways. And I think Hodaki tried to do something similar.
So the third thing for those not aware is, particularly in the duopoly in New Zealand, each company generally has a station that correlates to the same audience as. Flavour, My, Hodaki, Rock.
Exactly.
Would you guys counter-program and consider Hodaki, and
we'd look at
or just paddle your own waka?
We were very much, we were leaders.
Yeah,
I think, and we paddled our own waka in that way.
Yeah.
But for a little while in Auckland, there was Channel Z and there was the Rock. And they were both owned by MediaWorks, right? Because Channel Z had been started as an offshoot of More, so it was More FM and Channel Z, and then that was bought out by MediaWorks and brought into the family.
Yeah.
And Stephen Joyce, who was the CEO running things at the time, he was like, okay, well, we don't need an alternative rock station and a rock station. And he literally put it, Schusti was running Channel Z, Brad was running the Rock. He said, next survey, whoever finishes top keeps their frequency. Whoever doesn't loses it to the edge.
Yeah.
And we're bringing the edge to Auckland.
Yeah.
And we're giving them your frequency, whichever way around it goes. And so that was it. And then, I remember the night.
Were you guys in war rooms and so on, and strategy and
there was a lot of that going on, and you got to remember we were the same company.
Yeah,
and you had two stations going head to head at the same company.
Ugly.
So
it's ugly.
It wasn't pretty.
Yeah.
And then and we were friendly. So we had that. When survey results came out and they knew that Channel Z had lost to the Rock in that survey, that meant the Rock was staying and Channel Z was losing their frequency, and the edge was going to come up on it. I remember being out on the choppers. We used to go on survey nights. Were always a big night on the booze with Schusti, and Schusti was about being in tears because he knew, he felt like he'd failed, and he hadn't. He had done what he thought was right, and he still created great radio. And there's some great broadcasters that came out of there from under his tutelage.
I thought that you meant that on survey night your institution would foot you guys a helicopter, but on the choppers means...
on the chop means drinking, yeah. But I mean, people like Nathan Raruri and Bomber and John Bridges and, people like that came through Channel Z.
Absolutely.
Under Schusti, and they gave some... I mean, they broke Blind Spot.
Yeah.
When no one else would play Blind Spot. So, they're a station that, should be proud of what they did.
Speaking of breaking music, again, with the format that you guys had, you must have some proud moments of music that you broke in New Zealand, that you know, local bands.
Atlas, do you remember Atlas?
By name only, mate. Yeah, I'd probably have to Shazam the tune if I heard it.
Yeah, Shazam a song called Crawl.
Yeah.
And this was a great, I think, example of sometimes, and this is why you talked about why I got into radio was because of my love of music.
Yeah.
And Brad at The Rock was the same, he was a big music fan. That was a song that we both had gut instinct about. We both went, this is a fucking great song, great vocal, great line. So we did research. It sucked in research for about a month.
Yeah.
But we were determined that it was going to work because we knew it was a good song. We just had to convince everybody else it was a good song.
Yeah.
And so we kept playing it, and we turned that into a massive hit. We got plaques from New Zealand On Air for getting it X amount of hits and getting it to number one in New Zealand radio. And so we drove that. And now you look at things the way it's done, because I'm on the other side of it, right? So I'm plugging bands to radio, and if you have one rubbish research book, then you get dropped. It's not working. It's too unfamiliar. What's unfamiliar? Because you're not fucking playing it enough. That's the whole. What is the word I'm looking for? That's the whole paradox with kind of what I was talking about with really defined format radio. Yeah, and this might be an abstraction to answer. But because I know it would just be like, man, it's a vibe. This is the one. I get it. But okay, you go, that's a killer tune.
objectively, I'm going to listen to that back to front. This is you, the music listener. It's quite different to if it was a Venn diagram. Radio hit would be a smaller circle within that broader.
Yeah.
So what are you looking for? What goes, that's a hit on air on my format station?
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's trying to define the difference between what's a good song that you like and a good song for radio. One of the important things is get to the hook in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Or give me, it doesn't have to be the hook, but give me a hook. In 30 seconds, right?
Especially as our, over the years, as our attention spans have shrunk. Yeah. I mean, regular pop music production's actually packing as much as it can into the first few bars these days, right?
Totally. You want to make an impact straight away. I mean, Leon Ratt, who used to run The Edge for years and years and years, and he's now the head of radio for MediaWorks. You know, he would famously sit there and he'd put, in the days of CDs, put a CD on, 30 seconds in, if it wasn't doing it, he'd eject it. You didn't get past the first 30 seconds.
So I'm going to keep tabs. Number one, hook early, within 30 seconds. Yeah,
definitely hook early. That's a big one.
Stairway to Heaven wouldn't end up on the radio these days.
Exactly, it wouldn't. And that's the real pity.
That British drop broke the rules.
Yeah, totally. And sometimes you do have to break the rules, but you really have to make an impact in that first 30 seconds. Like, it doesn't have to be the chorus. You don't have to lead the chorus, but it needs to be something that grabs you and hooks you in.
So shut up, Lewis. So hook in 30 seconds. What's next?
Yeah, hook in 30 seconds is really, really important. Yeah. I think that's the most important thing. Yeah. You also, I mean, objectively talking about production, you know, there was a band who were really big in New Zealand that the rock never played or very rarely played because their production,
I was going to ask about
this. To production was almost lo-fi, and that was the Mint Chicks. You know, the Mint Chicks were big on the B nets. I know Channel Z had played them. A few other stations played them. And we were just like, don't get it. If you play that song next to a Foo Fighters song, next to a Metallica song... It
sits flat, because all the other tunes are probably way more compressed. And,
yeah, exactly. And it didn't sound right, so we never played it. So you've got to... You know, that's one thing I would say to artists and bands that go, I don't understand why such and such station's not playing my song. Go and listen to that radio station.
No, it makes total sense. Yeah.
And then put your song on. Or this is the other thing I've actually suggested to people is build your own Spotify playlist. Put your song in the middle of half a dozen songs that the station you want to hit are already playing. Yeah. And play it and listen to it and see how your song sounds amongst them.
Anything else?
Those are the two main things.
Yeah, really.
Make sure the qualities are there and make sure you give us a hook early. And I mean, we had a situation with 8 Foot Sativa. Who
I haven't heard that band name in a while.
And they had a show closed down in Christchurch because a fire alarm had gone off and it was the middle of winter. Yeah. And so the police were there, fire brigade were there, and you know they're doing their job, making sure that everybody's safe. But they kept everybody out on the footpath for like nearly an hour, 50 minutes or something, and so most people left. And so when they got to go back in, they played to a pretty much empty room. Yeah. And I understand the frustration from a musician's point of view. Yeah. But a member of 8 Foot Steve in an interview on the radio called the police and fire department from Christchurch cunts. And so they were forever banned after that. But you don't need to
be
a
genius. And that, kids, is a tale of...
you don't have to be a genius to figure out why that happened.
A little bit more on this. Another thing, again, I'm guessing not a lot of stations in those two companies have a lot of local music coming across their desk, but I'd imagine that the rock would have. Were you dealing with a lot of local demos?
Yeah, heaps. I probably had...
How many of those would make it to phase 2? Which is probably you raising an eyebrow or like putting it in a different pile.
Yeah, it would probably be, I would say, maybe around 1 or 2%.
Yeah,
it
wasn't
many, because I would probably get 100 a month submissions at times. Yeah. Different times a year, you got more and less. But, you know, when you're getting a blank CD sent to you with a vivid scribble on it, and that's it. It's like, well, if you can't be bothered with making time to do this, why should I give it?
And so, okay, about 2% gets to phase 2, and then a little bit of local music gets programmed from that.
Well, that's the other thing is...
I mean, there's only so many... The reality is you don't have a lot of real estate to begin with. No. You're vying for, like... Mayfair on the Monopoly board, aren't you?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And you got New Zealand on air as well, right? Are in the mix. So now, New Zealand on air, you've heard locals only on Hodaki. Yep. And you've heard the Kiwi Rock Soundcheck on The Rock, for example. And all those other stations, the My's, the Flavours, they all have their own version of it where they showcase New Zealand music. Well, New Zealand on air pay those stations... I don't know what it is now, but it used to be close to 6 figures a year to run that feature.
Yeah,
right?
For sure, yeah.
Okay, so... they also have a little bit of sway.
Yeah.
So they would go, hey, look, we're really pushing this track, and we pay for this feature. We want you to put this track on this feature because, and you would argue the toss if you really didn't believe it, but often it was enough to push a song over the line if you were trying to decide between
Interesting. Two. Right. You were in and around radio when we went from New Zealand radio playing 2% New Zealand music, which was by about 4 artists.
Yeah.
And it was like Poye, the Finn brothers,
Dragon.
Bit of Dobbin, yeah. How was that?
I think we were probably in a better spot than the CHR stations were. The Rock was still playing My Sex and Dragon and Split Ends, and, you could play some Crowded House and you'd get away with that sort of stuff.
Wait a sec, Computer Games by My Sex, that's not a rock song.
No, but we played it.
Right.
Yeah, because we needed it. But I tell you, there were ways to cheat the system, right? And so when that rule first came in, we were like, okay.
Don't tell me what, there's a New Zealand guitarist in this British band?
No, not quite that. We didn't cheat it that far, no. We couldn't get quite away from that. It had to be a New Zealand registered song. But what we did do is we created a New Zealand category, right?
Yeah.
And so all the songs that were New Zealand songs that we weren't already playing, that weren't on our playlist, went into this category. And then our midnight to 6 clocks got loaded with that category.
Right.
And so we dumped a lot of it in there.
Well, that still, I believe, goes on in, I think, quite a bit more of a nefarious way. And I do believe George FM, the dance music station, plays Waiata overnight because they're on a iwi license.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, and I don't know.
Which is odd when you tune into they play hard out drum and bass during the day and Waiata during the night. I'm like, surely this should be the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. It's I did work for a charitable trust for a while called Crescendo that Marcus from Blindspot had set up.
Yeah.
And it was me, him, Dave Attai from Nesian Mystic, Chip Matthews, we were there.
Yeah.
And it was all helping kids get into the music industry. And we had a radio station that I programmed, but we wanted to be able to put whoever came through and recorded with us, put their music on this station.
Yeah.
And it would do chart returns, which meant that when you applied for funding with New Zealand On Air, it said, has your song been played on radio that chart? We could tick a box, right?
Yeah.
But we made it open genre. So we had, I had pop category, I had a dance category, I had a rock category, I had a reggae roots category, I had a hip hop category, and I would just do an hour of this, an hour of that.
So the idea was extra foot up into getting funding.
Yeah, totally. And then it was also the idea that, not everybody that's going to come through here who loves music is going to be an artist that's successful. But we could turn you into we could give you some media training and you could end up being able to host, and we could give you a radio show. And so that was the idea of what we'd set up at Crescendo.
The last bit of Tailing Out of the Rock, this might be sad piano time here.
Yeah.
Is there less music programming and less music programmers now? I just had a student who got particularly interested in that area of things because I look after the third year radio and audio students over the road. And I just wondered how many roles there actually are out there realistically for him in New Zealand in 2022.
Not that many.
Programming radio,
Yeah, not that many. I mean, with the networking doesn't help.
I've heard that one programmer might oversee a number of stations now.
Yeah, generally they will have people working under them, though. So you may, for example, you might have Ross Flahive.
Music director?
Yeah, so you've got Ross Flahive who does that for ZM and Flavour. But then he will have a ZM and Flavour person who do all the scheduling and everything, and they also have input. So those are the entry-level places there. That's how you get into that.
Because you did it a long time, man. Like, I'm looking here, like 8 or 9, I reckon nearly 9 years. Mm-hmm. Did you move on because radio was changing?
Yeah, indirectly. I mean, I got made redundant. So,
did you?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. There's answers that.
So, radio was changing, and it decided it didn't need me. Well, at least the Rock didn't. So, it was a situation where, to cut a long story short, Robert and Jono, who were the Long-Time Drive show, Robert had decided he didn't want to renew. He was sick of being cattle prodded every Friday and doing pranks with Jono. he wanted to do some serious radio, so he was going to go to the Sound and talk about the music that he loved. And Jono and Ben's TV show was taking off at TV3. And ZM, apparently, I think it was ZM, had come in with a big offer for them to try and get them to bounce. MediaWorks were like, look, if you go, you lose your TV show, but in the meantime, let's do this deal. And they needed somewhere for them to sit, so they put them on Drive on the Rock. It wasn't the right fit, but that's kind of what they did. But it also meant that the Drive show went from costing them, I don't know, maybe $400,000 a year to costing them probably nearly double that. And
so now we know what those guys earn.
Yeah. So, well, back then, yeah. And so they had to find savings. So they restructured, and we had 4 people in management in a sort of 16-team.
Oh my God! Your job went to pay a jock.
Basically, yeah. So Brad was the general manager, if you like.
Yeah.
We had an operations manager. I was music director, and we had a marketing manager. And so the marketing manager's job basically got split between 2. Basically, they went up and looked after 2 stations, so they split it that way. And then the operations manager and the general manager took over music.
And how's your headspace, man? I asked this because we've had an announcement that 170 lecturers from AUT. Admittedly, there's 3 campuses. It's a very large organisation.
Yeah.
But 170, I'll say it again,
yeah.
lecturers are being full-time equivalent, are being made redundant. We're going to find out on December 1st. So no one knows whether they're staying or they're going, basically. So I'd imagine that you felt similar. It's kind of stressful and shit in that regard, right?
Yeah, totally.
But did you come out the other end okay? I'd imagine you had lots of connections and resources and so on. Like, yeah, how did you pop out the other end of it? It was help me, please.
yeah. No, it was. You're right, because I'd never been made redundant before.
No,
and it was like a real family over there.
10 years, man. Nearly 10 years.
Yeah, well, I'd been there nearly, I think, 15 or up.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'd done like 8 or 9 as the music director.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I don't know that I know how to do anything else.
Yeah.
And which is a lie, because I did. I just didn't know that I knew. And it took my partner to sort of get me to take a step back to look at the bigger picture, to go, actually, you can do this. You've got lots of talents.
Are you a creature of habit with the 15 years? Because you got a lot of projects on the go, so you don't strike me as a guy like that. But I could see how even just the thought of driving somewhere else to go to work's all a bit weird after 15 years.
It's a bit weird. And, the funny thing was, we were all in the same, we're in the same building as a bunch of other stations.
Yeah.
And it worked well for me. Not that you wish ill on anybody else, but I had been doing a little bit of... my sports interest was football, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd been doing a football show with Winton Rufer on a talk station that we had.
Yeah.
And the guy who was producing Breakfast passed away. He had a heart attack, suddenly passed away. Coincided with me getting made redundant.
Wow.
And so they went, hey, look, you've got experience. Can you come and produce our breakfast show for us while we get back on our feet?
So every time you're at a crossroads in your career, someone either dies or goes to rehab.
Yeah.
and a role opens up.
It's one way of looking at it. I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, I mean, and that's what happened, and I ended up in that role for 6 months.
Jokes aside, like in hindsight, do you think it was good for you that moved you on and made you try something different?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It sort of broadened my horizons.
Yeah.
Got me doing different things, got me stretching myself in other ways, got me improving myself in other ways, I did a bit of work at Crescendo, as I mentioned, I was there for about a year or so, and did a lot of stuff that felt like I was making a difference, which was really good. I felt good to be giving back in a way,
And is the move to talk, which we'll talk about more later, but there's a lack of emphasis with music on radio these days, right? Do you think radio has changed a lot in the last decade?
Yeah, it has, and it's because of things like Spotify, right? Now, so, I mean, if you like AC/DC, for example, you can listen to the rock and hear AC/DC, but you're also going to potentially have to sit through stuff that you don't want to hear. Right?
Opshot.
Yeah, for example. But if you've got Spotify, you can go, fuck it. I can put on an AC/DC playlist and listen to AC/DC all day. And you don't have to worry about it. So that's the problem. Everybody all of a sudden had a jukebox on their phone. They could listen to whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, right? They weren't relying on radio for it. So radio had to pivot. And it had to become something different. And it had to deliver you content that you couldn't dial up on Spotify.
Yeah.
So that's why it had to become more... content driven. It had to be funny things, whether it's people getting cattle prodded for stunts, whether it was funny interviews, whether it was this, that, the other, whatever entertainment radio is doing these days. They had to pivot and do that to retain relevance.
So they've kind of like turned up the morning zoo to 11 kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. The stuff that Howard Stern was doing 20 years ago, now that's what everybody needs to be doing to be relevant. And
it's the radio brand now, rather than the radio station.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's always been about entertainment and information.
One other thing that gets lost in this conversation is radio's about location or a sense of place, and that worries me with our whole extended conversation. I mean, I know the world changes, and that's a terrible trap, getting caught in like, I wish it not like it used to be.
Yeah.
But I think a localness gets lost a lot with things like Spotify. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. I listen to 95% probably overseas podcast content a week.
Yeah.
But it's very different to when I really felt like I had my boots on the ground when I listened to local radio and it had all that content.
Totally.
Do you agree there's a bit of a loss there?
Yeah, there's definitely a loss there.
Yeah.
You know?
Even coming back to when they started networking 20 years ago, that's the beginning of that kind of loss,
Well,
you
exactly.
know?
I mean, you used to have, you know, in small town New Zealand, well, not even small town, but even towns like the size of Tauranga now take, you know, more FM days from Auckland. They don't take it, you know, so you don't have that local guy who was a bit of a local celebrity that you heard on the radio turning sausages on a Saturday outside your Bunnings. You know, he's not there anymore. And,
I wonder what he's doing now.
Yeah, well, exactly. Probably in sales.
What he's doing now?
Yeah.
Like voiceovers for 3 key clients.
Yeah. Things like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's changed all of that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But, I mean, and podcasting, it's interesting you say that about it because I listen to a lot of podcasts as well. But I do a podcast with a mate of mine who owns a comic book shop, right?
Yeah.
And we started it as a way to get word out about his business. And I was a broadcaster.
Oh, is that Heroes? What's it called?
Heroes for Sale.
Heroes for Sale,
So
yeah.
I'm a broadcaster who had dabbled in comics. I like The Punisher and I like Conan. That was about me.
Yeah.
And this guy that's been his whole life. And so he's opened up all these doors for me and I'm reading lots more of that kind of stuff. And we're doing that. But I look at where our listeners are.
Yeah.
And only about half are in New Zealand.
Really?
We've got a lot of listeners in India, a bunch in the UK, some in the US, some in Canada. It's interesting.
I think you're completely mad 99.9% of the time if you're doing a podcast because you want it to be a big thing and you're going to be Rogan. There's a lot of those around though, man, trust me. There's a lot of people who are quite naive around that. But anyway, speaking of overseas listenership, like there's a story of, I don't know if you know the comedian Tim Batt.
Yeah.
Him and his mate did that worst idea of all time where they watched like Grown Ups 2, I think every week for a year.
And they podcasted about it, right?
But it's basically like a study in existential decline, right? and friendship. But, you know, unprompted by them, a really big American film pop culture podcast, you know, had an extended rant about that show. And those guys are in the tens of millions of downloads, you know. And Tim's since been to the UK and to Hollywood kind of pitching stuff and doing live shows and so on. It's interesting. I just sort of thought, because the reason I brought that up is that just speaks to an earlier conversation about trying to break through as a musician on the radio, you know. So things change in terms of how things are picked up.
Yeah, and I actually remember Tim as a young producer coming through.
Yeah,
at
I think that
there.
guy's a smart dude, man, and all his work is bang on. Where were we before talking about listening to podcasts?
We were talking about Spotify and the way radio's changed in the last 10 years.
Very good. By the way, you and I absent latchkey parents with that Podcasting New Zealand site. Do you approve the posts? What's going on?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do. Well, I don't approve all of them.
Good on you.
I've got a couple other people that I've made admins.
It's a shame. We need to try. Yeah, we need to try and perk that up a bit.
Do you want to be an admin?
No, you made me an admin. That's what I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. I was putting on the podcasting summit, and you go, look, I'll just make you an admin. I was like, great.
Yeah.
Music, podcasting. Sport radio. I assume that. What's the name of your station? It's an acronym, isn't it?
SENZ.
SENZ.
Yep.
I imagine as a response to or an emergence from the ashes of Radio Sport, right? Because that left a gap.
Yeah, it left a massive gap.
Yeah.
SEN is an Australian company, and they've got 291 frequencies in Aussie, and they're massive, and they're big on podcasting.
Are they all AM like here?
There's a mix. They've got a few FMs, but predominantly AM because most of it's sort of country Australia.
Yeah,
and they started with racing. A
big reach, man.
A lot of racing. And actually, the guy that started at Hutch, who's the boss man, he's a journo. He started as a journo. And you know what? He was podcasting before it was podcasting. So he was doing these sports shows and then selling them to satellite radio stations around Australia for content.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how he started.
Wait, before we get to sports radio, this is kind of sports radio if you call racing a sport. You were at TAB Radio for a long time, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a racing guy at all. Were you? You don't strike me as a...
Well, but I was employed to do a sports breakfast show.
Right.
So they were racing from 10 o'clock and we were sports 6 till 10.
Yeah.
That was the idea. So, yeah. But, you learn things. I mean, we still, we were sport, but we still had to do, if it was New Zealand Cup Day or Melbourne Cup Day, we had to do a big thing on that song and dance around that.
Because, it feels like a bit of an anachronism now, but I'm not, I mean, I just don't know. I guess there's still a lot of old dudes out there listening to the racing on their transistor. That seems like something from my childhood.
Yeah, and well, I mean, the thing is that there's a lot now of younger guys with a bit of money, who punt. You know? So have you heard of Boys Get Paid?
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, those guys, you know, they just, I think they made something like $500,000 on the Christchurch Cup as a syndicate.
I read their name. I didn't like their energy.
Yeah, well,
Boys Get Paid.
Boys Get Paid. Yeah, it's a bit like that. But I mean, you know, and that's where SENZ is trying to push. You know, I mean, the app that SENZ have got, and I know this is going to sound like a bit of an advertising.
No, go for it.
Is probably the cleverest radio app I've used. It's certainly better than Rover and better than iHeart, I think, in terms of interactiveness. So when you're in the app, if you're listening to the station and you want to text in or you want to ring, and you can do that within the app. You don't have to jump out of the app.
That's great, man.
You know, which is clever. Yeah. And the other thing is...
So someone's developed an immediate portal to the station.
To the station. And the other thing is, and if you're, say, a big rugby league fan...
Yeah.
The breakfast show in Sydney is Andrew Voss, who's the big Fox caller for that, and Greg Alexander, who's the ex-Kangaroo, and you know, etc. So it's a very rugby league orientated breakfast show. But if you're in New Zealand and you're a rugby league fan, you can go on the app and listen to their breakfast show. You can listen to any of their stations, 291 frequencies around Australia.
Yeah, when I looked at it today and had to listen to a few things, that's what struck me as, even though that's why I asked about the AM frequencies, is even though there's a bunch of AM frequencies which makes sense for that entrenched older sports audience, I thought these guys are trying to bring in a younger audience. So I was going to ask you about online and streaming, and then you said they've come with an app. My spidey senses were like, that's where the future in this is.
Yeah.
You must do a lot of. How often are you on the mic there? Like, I looked at. It seems like you're the host of every second podcast, or is that just repurposed content from the radio? Like, I think you're the anchor host on every city. Like, I think weren't you like the host on the Hurricane show, and then you're the host on the
rugby shows.
All the super rugby shows. So they're actually standalone podcasts that you host.
Yeah, but they were shows that then get turned into podcasts.
So it's repurposed radio. Right.
Yeah, exactly right. So I was doing 6 super rugby shows a week, half an hour each time with a different co-host.
Because you're on here every night, right?
Well, at the moment, I'm doing Ian Smith's at the T20 World Cup, which is probably going to date this podcast, sorry. I've been him for the last 3.5 weeks while he's been there, so I've been doing 9 till midday.
Oh, okay.
I move around a bit. But, usually I'm Sunday afternoons and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights.
And so is it a small team of you doing a lot of on-air stuff? Yeah,
it is.
And how did you just, so this is backtracking a little, but how did you get involved? Asked, or did you approach them?
I asked initially when I heard rumours that SEN were going to pick up all the old TAB frequencies when TAB radio folded. So I asked, got in the air, and then when they started building the roster, then I got invited along, and then we had a couple of people fall over, and I ended up with a full-time position as opposed to being a casual. Oh,
so TAB radio did fold, perhaps for the reasons I said, like their audience had literally died out.
Well, close, COVID.
Ah.
So they closed the radio operation, made us all redundant. So that was my second redundancy.
Right.
During COVID, yeah.
But aside from the app, which kind of probably speaks as a example of the broader question, what are you guys doing differently to what Radio Sport did?
We're trying to be more entertainment focused.
Yeah.
Okay. So it doesn't always have to be an attack on someone. It doesn't always have to be serious. It doesn't always have to be rugby.
Right.
You know,
that's a great answer, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, rugby is still a big driver.
Yeah.
But it is, the breakfast show...
Radio Sport had that talkback energy. You make me think about it.
Yeah. But our breakfast show is Israel Dagg and Tony Kemp, right? Two former internationals with a guy called Louis Herman Watt as the executive producer.
Yeah.
And those guys have a lot of fun, They got Sean Kenny Dowell on, who's the... former leaguey, former Kiwis, played a lot of played for the Roosters, etc. They got him on, and they had him rapping, and then Kempy was rapping with him, and they do different stuff like that. It doesn't take itself as seriously, maybe. I mean, you've got guys like Ian Smith, of course, when he does his show, he likes to laugh, but he's also more your serious guy. And then you've got Mark Stafford, who's a sports broadcaster, who's been around for years, who's great. He does the afternoons, and then like the drive show is Beaver, Stephen Donald, who kicked the winning goal in the 2011 World Cup final with Kerr Stanway from Sky, and they do things like they'll have a team naming Tuesday every week where whatever's news they'll go, all right, well, what can we do? Oh, it's the US Open. If you had to put a 15 together to play rugby of just pro tennis players, who's in your team?
Yeah, I love that sort of thing.
And they do that.
Like whatever the topic is, I love that. But I think a lot of people do when it's done well.
Do you know Mania Stewart?
No.
He produces that show. He's very clever. He used to be at Horak. He worked with Lee Hart and Jason Hoyt.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a great team to work with. So you are on the mic for a lot of the show, right? It's a lot of content to come up with. Is there a lot of prep? Do you have a producer? Have you learnt a lot about other sport in the last however long?
Yeah, I mean, probably when I was at the TAB, I had to start learning about other sports.
Yeah.
Like I didn't generally
Let me tell you about the Alaskan Bowling League.
Yeah, there's a lot of that sort of stuff that you find out about. I'll tell you, there's some...
Imagine doing it... I mean, you don't have to imagine, because you have done radio before the internet, but what a gift.
Makes life so much easier.
Yeah, content-wise.
In real time, I can be interviewing you, Lewis, I can say, "Hey, Lewis, at that T20 World Cup last night, that game, Mitch Santner's bowling effort. What did you make of it?"
Yeah.
And while you're giving me your answer, I've thought of something else that I want to ask you, but I don't know the details. I can blah 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 and bring up the information. And when you're finished answering that question, I can go, "Yeah, well, I mean, he bowled 20 overs at that World Cup for 129 runs, so his economy rate's great." But is he taking enough wickets?
Yeah.
And then, is that immediate?
So this sort of relates to my earlier question. It's like, must keep on your toes.
Totally.
Having the mic hot for that many hours a night or a day at the moment.
And we've got two producers most shows as well. So you've got a content producer and you've got a tech producer for every show as well.
Right. And we'll finish up soon, mate. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, I'll go pick my daughter up.
All the meanwhile, you've had the same band going since the late 90s.
Yeah.
Mid-90s?
No, it was definitely late... was it late 90s? No, I think it was early 2000s, to be honest. I think it was about 2002.
Same bunch of you?
It was me and the same guitar player.
Yeah.
And then the bass player left, had a family and came back.
Yeah.
And so we had another bass player in between. But we're a bit Spinal Tap. We go through drummers a bit. But none of them have exploded yet, which is good. I've been doing... we've got 3 full-length albums out. We've done lots of shows. We've played Vector. We opened for Korn. We've opened for Megadeth. We've opened for Fear Factory. Sepultura, Death Angel, a whole bunch of big metal acts that we've played with. So,
did you meet? Trust me, I know that often this doesn't happen. But did you meet the salty Dave Mustaine?
I've interviewed him twice. Yeah, actually.
Have you pre-Jesus, post-Jesus?
We didn't talk about Jesus.
No,
but I think the first one was definitely pre-Jesus, and it was backstage at the Logan Campbell Centre.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know that backstage area, but there's a long hallway and there's a dressing room right at the end on the right, and that's like the main dressing room. So we got ushered down there. We got by the record company person, like, okay, he's ready for you. Go in there. Huge bag of weed on the desk.
I thought he was Cleanie Pants.
So did I.
If you've organised weed when you're touring on the other side of the world, you're not.
Yeah, the place absolutely stunk. And so we walk in, and then he's like trying to push it to one side, and we shut the door so we could set up some lights because it was for Juice TV when I was down in the middle bar on Juice TV. Yeah. And he's like, "Oh, can we keep this door open? I need to get the smell out of here." And he was kind of casting dark glances at his tech, like kind of trying to blame the tech. And he was funny because. But
at the end of the day, a receptive interview, or
well, that's what I was going to say.
Sorry, mate.
So, at the start, he was like, the lights were being set up, and he was grumbling away, and he's like, and then he's like, "How long is this going to take?"
Yeah.
And I kind of went, "Oh fuck, you know what?" So I turned around and I said, "Dave, it's up to you, mate. If you feel like talking today, it could be 15 minutes. If you don't feel like talking, it could be done in 5."
Yeah.
And he just went, "Oh, okay."
Hit him with that Kiwi, that Kiwi vibe.
And then he was great. He was magic after that. So
because anyone like that doing junkets and stuff, or when you do your press, and you got a lot of people really pushy. A lot of people come with really dumb questions. I always remember someone telling me they had interview time with one of the guys from Def Leppard. It was one of those 15, and the guy that was telling me actually managed to get quite good out of them because I had good questions, whatever happened. But he said the person behind him asked a question like, "Oh, so you called Def Leppard, like, if you were an animal, like, just asked, like, so you're sort of dealing with, after a day of that and a bunch of people, I could see how that would sort of wind you up."
Well, you got to know, like, here's a tip for you. If you're interviewing someone like that, ask them the interesting questions first,
Yeah.
and then ask them, once you've got a bit of a vibe for them,
Yeah.
you get whether what they're up for, then you can drop in dumb shit if you want.
Yeah, totally.
You know? I did an interview recently with one of the football ferns, and I'd just been clearing out my book collection, and I'd had these footballer autobiographies, and there's a guy called Frank Worthington who was a bit of a working-class George Best, fancied himself as a ladies' man, and on the cover of the book is him holding a cup of tea, and the book title is One Hump or Two. and I said to her, I said, oh, look, we've got this book. What would if you were going to write an autobiography, what would it be called?
Great.
So I turned it, but I did that at the end, and I told her pre-interview, hey, at the end we'll do 5 quick questions to get to know you better, and it'll be a bit of fun. And so she was up for that.
Isn't George Best a working class George Best?
Well, George, when I say working class, he came from the working class.
Yeah.
But that man is gold standard. Frank Worthington.
Yeah, I get it. He was the term I'd use is he was a house brand. He was a house brand George Best.
He was panned.
So let's finish on this, man. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for gifting your time. And since I said people like those kind of lists or whatever, or the sort of thing that seems fitting, can you think of, putting you on the spot a little, some of the best interviews you've had over the years, and perhaps a couple of the worst?
Couple of the worst. One of the worst would have been that Ozzy Osbourne one I mentioned earlier, and that was more on me than on him, to be fair. There was an interview that I did with, I'm trying to remember the name now, they were terrible. They were one of those bands, they were an American sort of pop punk band that thought they were fucking rock stars, but no one had actually heard of them.
I don't want to say any names here, because but anyway, so you had no respect going in. That's always a good start.
Yeah, well, and it was, and I'm
fuck
open,
these guys. Okay,
and I'm open to going, hey, these are you guys trying to make it.
Yeah,
right. I'll do them a solid, and I'm do this interview and get to know them.
Yeah.
But if you're going to act like a dick, then I'll fucking that was it. And some of the best did a really good interview with Lars Ulrich, the drummer from Metallica. Yeah, we talked a lot about his he was big into his diving, and he'd just been to the Great Barrier Reef, so we talked a lot about that.
A lot of people hate his energy and his way of doing things, man. But I'd happily interview that guy. What a great interviewee.
He's an interviewer's dream.
Yeah,
he is absolutely superb. So he's
and I think that energy drove a lot of the success of the band. Over the years. Yeah.
Totally. So he'd be up there. He'd be one of the best interviews I've ever done. He was great.
Cool. Great, man. Well, thank you. I'll put I'll put the links and so on to where people can hear you and to your band and stuff. I'll do that in the intro.
Okay. Sounds good.
You go pick up your daughter. How old is she?
9. Okay. Just about 10.
Just about 10.
Just about 16.